You're listening to the But What If I Said podcast. I'm your host, Skylar Galloway. Wow, that is weird. I feel like I sound really weird. I'm trying this new thing with this new platform, and so let's see how this goes. Bear with me. First episode of a brand new podcast. I'm going to try to have this over on YouTube. So if I ever refer to the way that I look or actual physical, in the camera video kind of thing, that's what I'm talking about is just, it potentially being on YouTube and people actually being able to see what I'm doing. So I wanted to go ahead and give a brief introduction. Today's episode, it will be more of, an introduction to what this podcast will be about, as well as a little bit of a lead up to how I got here. And I do have a script on the camera, on my computer. So I'm reading from a script, not the whole time, but for the most part, I'm reading from a script because if I don't have a script, then I say weird things and I have to delete a lot of things. So I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that, and that's what I'm doing right now. So anyway, I hope this podcast is entertaining to you and that you laugh along with me because I just get embarrassed. Maybe people will laugh with me and not at me. But I wanted to go ahead and get into the introduction. So you may be wondering what happened to the other podcast, because I did used to have, for those of you who don't know, it was a podcast about a year ago for a while called Metaphoric Metamorphic, and it was focused on spreading awareness about mental health. And while I loved doing that podcast and I felt I got a lot out of it, and I was told that others also got a lot out of it, I was going through a transition period in my life in many different ways. And honestly, I could not keep up with it and all of my own mental issues that I was facing at the time. So I said I was going to take a break and see what happened. And a few months later, I had a season 2 to that podcast in the works, but my heart really wasn't in it due to some things that had happened during the break. I felt like, that my mindset had changed a little bit on some of these things. And so I wanted to take a longer break to try to get my mind where it needed to be to mix mental health in with my relationship with God. And so really that is what it boiled down to figure out where my relationship with God and mental health fit together. Not that they don't, but I was just kind of confused because I was listening over here to some of these things and I was listening over here to some of these things. So I really just had to get out all the distractions and opinions out, shut everybody out, and figure out what God was saying. And so that brings me here. So what happened during the break? I actually started the process of moving while I was doing the podcast regularly, toward the last podcast that I put out. And I was so stressed about moving, having to keep up with everything, as well as homeschooling my kids. And if you don't know, I'm a stay-at-home homeschool mom with 2 school-age kids and a toddler. And at that time, Harley, my youngest, she was barely 1. And so it was a lot for me to keep up with when I was moving to a town where I feared people would judge me. So I was just hermiting. I was isolating. I started isolating again. And that's something that I did subconsciously when things started to get bad again with my mentality. And it got worse and worse where I wasn't really talking to anyone. And of course we had moved. So I was just at home all the time and everything was different and everything was weird. And it was just such a season of change that I was so uncomfortable getting out of my home, especially with the trauma that I had been through. If you guys, I don't know if you know, if you're watching this, you probably know the trauma that I went through. But if you didn't, you can look back on the episodes previously that I'm going to leave on this podcast. And I'm basically just transitioning from, Metaphoric Metamorphic to the But What If I Said podcast. So I'm leaving the old videos up because I feel like those are important. And if you don't know my story, you can look back through the old episodes. I think there's even one on there about my story about being stalked. And so you can look back at that. So I was isolating. But after a while of isolating myself, I realized that I couldn't do that because that's where I was headed was where I'd already been. I don't know, some people know my story, some people don't, but before I got to a point where I was contemplating suicide, it was isolation. Like I just completely was isolated for a reason. There was a reason behind that. But not that I was going to get to that point again, but I was headed toward the isolation that ended up in severe depression. And so I realized earlier on that I needed to get out of that and I needed to go back to church because I was near my old church again, because we had moved back toward that direction. And the reason why I hadn't been going to church is because the distance from the church that I liked to go to, that I was like a member of, it was too far away. So, my husband and I actually got married at this church by the youth pastor, and it was and still is near and dear to my heart. So I was really excited, when we moved, because I could go here again to this church. Anyway, so I wanted to start trying to go back to church. I knew I needed to. I knew that it could potentially help me out of the dark mentality that I was in. And I used to go to church pretty regularly and had what I thought was a decent relationship with God, although I would have even considered myself lukewarm, as the Bible calls it. It wasn't like a wonderful, spirit-filled, spirit-led relationship. And so I really wanted that, but didn't know how to get there. So that's what I did. I went back to church. And at first my attendance was like once every few weeks, but then it became like an every Wednesday kind of thing. Then after meeting and chatting with someone who's now my best friend, Kira, I started going on Sundays too. And for the most part, I go just about every time the doors are open, unless someone's sick or something has come up, but it has to be something that is a pretty big deal. I mean, I normally don't miss, and it's not to be like religious or whatever. It's just because I don't feel like, I feel like I need to go. Like, I really feel like I need to go. Oh my goodness. Of course, I would get all these notifications on my computer right now as I am trying to read a script and record a podcast episode, while I don't even need to be distracted. I did not get any emails until now, right now. Like, I've got like 47 notifications for email, and I shouldn't have gotten all those notifications at once. It should have been like 15 minutes ago. That is kind of weird. Okay, so Kira, oh my gosh, it's the devil. It is the devil. The devil is over here trying to distract me because he knows that there is something good going to come out of this. It literally, it's like keeps on popping up over and over and over again in the corner of the screen. Okay. So Kira, her and I became really, really close. And she honestly was the puzzle piece for me this time. Like, I honestly believe that God sent her to help hold me accountable and to introduce me to spiritual warfare. And she even told me that she felt a prompting to talk to me at church and to exchange phone numbers. And I'm so glad that she listened to the Holy Spirit, because if I had not met her, I don't think I'd be where I am today. And that's why our obedience to God is so important for situations exactly like this. And we'll talk about that at a later time. So as time went on, I kept going to church. My relationship with God turned from something that I thought was personal, which actually wasn't personal after all, to something I had never imagined it would be. So I've learned so much, so much more in this short amount of time at the beginning of this year, probably about March until now. Some of these things that I've learned is stuff that I was never taught in a church or by a pastor or even by parents or relatives. So that's why I'm here. I'm here to stand in the gap for those of you who are like I was, to open your eyes to the things that we have never been told for the most part, or if we have been told these things, it was extremely brief and never talked about much, if at all again. There is a severe lack of this in the church. So I'm here to be a flame in the dark. So that brings me to my questions for the day. So these questions are, but what if I said that the things you learned growing up in church was just a tiny piece of what is actually to be learned? What if there is more to experience with the relationship with God? What if you have been, probably unintentionally, shorted information your entire life, probably because the person who taught you things didn't know these things either? I'm not saying your pastors or your teachers that you have been under your entire life are wrong. I'm saying that they're also unaware. It's time to light the flame. So that's why I wanted to start this podcast, because it is time to light the flame. Okay, so I also wanted to say too that if you didn't know, I wrote I wrote a book called Thrill Sought. And that is the book that I wrote whenever I was doing the other podcast. But I wrote another book while I was gone. It's called When the Rain Came. This is what it looks like. When the Rain Came, written by Skylar Galloway, a true story that exemplifies God's hand in everything. So this is a testimony book. You probably can't even read that because it's backwards. But this is a book about my testimony from the time that I was basically born until like about 6 months ago. This book is the one that I wrote about being stalked and what had happened, my experience, my mental health journey. This is the one that I had already written. It's much shorter. It's not as well written. This other book that I recently wrote, the one I just showed you, that one is much better written. But anyway, I wanted to show those. Those are available both on Amazon. And I don't want to show it just to be like, buy my stuff, give me money. Like, that's not the thing. Of course, that's great. That's great. But this book that I just came out with on October 26th of 2022 this year. This book is it is supposed to be an inspiration to other people, where if you have been through things and you didn't think that you would make it, and you read someone else's testimony who had also been through things and didn't think that they would make it, and then look what happened to them. Look where I'm at now from where I was. This is supposed to be encouragement and inspiration to other people and create a fire for God in people again because of what he's brought us out of. And it introduces where I have started to learn about spiritual warfare, some things that I will cover in this podcast, some things that I didn't know were true, things that, like I said, I'm going to talk about in this podcast. And just like makes it like illustrates it. It talks about how I realized where God had a plan for my life the entire time, but also so did the devil, and how the devil was present and how we neglected the fact that he's present. And we have to fight him off. So that's where I'm at today. That's what we're going to be talking about on this podcast. And I'm just going to kind of go as I can, and whatever God tells me to do, I'm going to do it. And I really feel like God has told me to do this podcast. The next few episodes will probably be I'm hoping a lot more professional. I really would like to learn this whole this thing that I'm using, this platform that I'm using a little bit better. So I hope as I go on, they're going to become better and more professional seeming. But at the same time, just like I'm dressed like this today with no makeup on or anything, like I want to be as real as possible. I want to be somebody who is just like everybody else. I don't want to be somebody who comes on here and has perfect makeup, perfect hair, because that's not somebody that is realistic. And I feel that if someone comes on somewhere on the internet and they look perfect all the time, then it makes me feel like I'm not like them and like I'm less than them. And I don't want that to feel like this, or I don't want this to feel like that. So I would like to look normal. And this is what I normally look like, because I'm at home most of the time and I'm doing things at home most of the time, and it just doesn't matter what I look like. So with that being said, I hope that you'll tune in to the next episode, because the next episode is actually going to be about a topic that a lot of people probably need to hear, and probably don't even know that they need to hear it. And then I'll have, episodes roll out, I'm hoping every week, but we will see how God wants me to do these things, because I feel like our time is short here, and that things need to hurry up and be said, and people need to be freed from things that they didn't even know that they needed freed from. And a lot of people are probably going to think I'm a nutcase, but that doesn't matter, because like one of my aunts even told me, Jesus was mocked. Jesus was mocked. A lot of people thought he was insane or blasphemous, and he was killed. He insulted people so much that he was killed. And so, I mean, we're going to be mocked. We're going to be persecuted as Christians, as people who believe in Jesus, as people who believe in God, people who believe in what Jesus did. And so that's just fine if people mock. But for the people who won't, or even the people who do, but then come to realize later on that I was right, I have to say these things, you know? So anyways, I will see you next time on the But What If I Said podcast.